Welcome to this edition of Hub Hits, talking about a new set of laws, bylaws that are coming into effect, supposedly to protect religious and other communities in Toronto, the GTA, from those protests. We know them. They're loud. Occasionally, they seem to threaten violence. To help understand this all and to kind of unpack some of its implications, a real pleasure to welcome onto the program Joanna Baron. She's the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Do I have that right, Joanna?
Yeah, you got it, Rudyard.
Awesome. Well, thank you for writing this piece. Why don't we begin by having you explain the concept of bubble zones? Your article introduced this to me. What are they and why have they come about?
So in the case of Toronto, the bylaw allows any place of worship, school, childcare center to apply for a 1-year, 50-meter bubble zone surrounding the facility. So within that ring, bylaw officers can essentially ticket individuals who, the wording of the bylaw is discourage attendance, ask passerby to stay away, block access, or voice disapproval. And as you mentioned, it was meant to protect vulnerable communities, for example, like the Jewish community, especially that I belong to. But as I go into in my piece, and I assume we'll get into, in my opinion, it overreaches in constitutionally suspect ways.
Yeah. So, Joanna, if I'm going to understand this correctly, this is a response, sounds like an imperfect one, as you'll explain to us, about how we're going to manage this increasing number of protests. And let's call it out for what it is. These protests are predominantly directed towards the Jewish community in relation to events in the Middle East and the war in Gaza. So what does the Jewish community think about this? Was the Jewish community asking for these laws? Is there a kind of live debate in the community? Are these generally thought as unfortunate but necessary responses given the kind of decline, the deterioration of the public square in Canada for the last 600 plus days?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a really important point, which is that I think there's been a really live internal debate within the Jewish community about this. Certainly organized bodies of the Jewish community, like the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, put a full court press behind this. And I understand their constituents are saying, I'm going to synagogue, I'm dropping my kid off at school, and there's protesters, like you have to do something. On the other hand, I think even the most full-throated supporters of these bubble zone laws within the Jewish community acknowledge that it's not a positive thing. It's a Pyrrhic victory is how I refer to it in my piece. It acknowledges that, Jews are at a point where we feel so vulnerable that we have to lobby for special protections, which to me is kind of like a blinking warning sign.
Yeah, you talk about civic moats. That's how we've titled your excellent essay in the Hub today. And I guess, Joanna, that's the concern, right? Is that while this bylaw may afford some protections, what effectively a community is having to do is to concede that it is separating itself in some way, in some real and tangible way, from the public square, from what should be a place that is safe for everyone, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity. So these laws, Joanna, I guess in a way would be a big concession that it's not safe and we don't really have a public square anymore whereby, people are allowed to express themselves freely without the threat of violence.
Yeah, so two comments. First of all, for me, as the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor who has studied the history of what was happening in Europe leading up to the greatest crime in history, for me, this has uncomfortable historical echoes, right? We're going to cordon ourselves off, create a shtetl or a ghetto, which I don't like. I want to be an equal civic participant, and I am. Second of all, though, I understand the desire to protect our community, but I think part of why we've gotten into this really unacceptable state of affairs is, I have to say, the failures of law enforcement. Because when protesters cross the line into harassment or disruption, preventing people from accessing religious spaces, intimidation, noise violations, we have laws on the books to deal with that. And what we don't need, and what this law is really doing, is a law that criminalizes speech based on what somebody believes or says, this vague, discouraging attendance. So the police really have a failure to answer for here.
Yeah. Maybe, Joanna, just to explain to non-Jewish listeners and viewers, myself included, just the level of security that is now having to happen at Jewish schools and places of worship. I understand, it's metal detectors, it's police cars, it's a level of protection that both the community has had to provide for itself through private security, but also public security that in a way is really kind of unprecedented in modern Canadian history.
So it is and it isn't. So me personally, I'm a millennial. As far back as my memory goes, we always had to go through metal detectors to get into synagogue, particularly on high-profile Jewish days like the high holidays. Then there are these bumps that happen, like the 2018 Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh, that you see an increase. And yes, it is true that it's at a virtual fever pitch. I had the privilege of attending the Nova exhibition this past weekend, and it was like the police had cordoned off the whole block in North York, and it's a frightful scene to see.
Yeah. So, Joanna, what's your solution? Because, look, I'm sympathetic to the idea that, we need a public square which everyone can be, participants in. So if in your view, these bubble laws, again, are leading to a kind of ghettoization of a community on the basis of the fear of violence, and now this response, which, as you pointed in your article, I think is very interesting, is not insignificant. Like, once you're designated, maybe explain this to listeners and viewers, once you get this designation, which is kind of, if I believe Joanna, a kind of self-reported by the group who has extended these protections, they're there in effect for 12 months based, in a sense, on a single incident. Is that right?
There doesn't even have to be an incident. So if the subjective fear of the manager or owner of the establishment, like a synagogue or a community center, believes that there's a probability that individuals will attend and express discouragement, they can request the bylaw to apply to them for 1 year. This is approved by bureaucrats. So effectively, we're approving, giving bureaucrats the power to approve or deny constitutionally protected speech, even if it's riddled by anti-Semitism, even if we disagree with it, but it's protected speech near more than 3,000 locations in the city of Toronto. And that is a tremendous amount of power over expression to give the state, particularly city bureaucrats.
Yeah. So, Joanna, what could be an alternative solution? Because that these communities are feeling unsafe. It's not simply they're feeling unsafe. There are people that have shot at schools and synagogues. There are physical altercations that happen. So in the absence of these bubble laws, what are we to do? Because there's the world as we wish it, and then the world as it is.
Absolutely. So first of all, it's important to emphasize that even a bubble zone is not going to do anything about having an anti-Semitic person show up at Beis Yaakov school and shoot bullets into the window, right? That is not what this bylaw is about. That is clearly already criminal conduct. So the sort of more tangible thing is, first of all, the cops need to start enforcing the laws on the books. We saw recently there was a protester who appeared to direct a smoke bomb towards somebody eating at Cafe Landwehr, a Jewish-owned cafe or cafe in downtown Toronto, and that person was charged with mischief. So the cops need to not be afraid to call out illegal conduct. I live a few minutes walk from Yonge and Bloor. There have been whole days where that intersection has been shut down by pro-Palestinian protesters, again, impeding public roads is not protected speech. So the cops need to enforce the laws properly. More broadly, though, I think the Jewish community, we need to understand how resilient we are. We are blessed to be a community of lawyers, of advocates, and we shouldn't, we shouldn't insulate ourselves first from the anti-Semitism that happens, just make them go away and think that we'll stay safe. And we shouldn't be afraid to defend ourselves, our values, and indeed the values of the world's only Jewish state.
Joanna Baron, fascinating words and a fascinating article that our listeners and viewers can find in the Hub today, www.thehub.ca. Joanna Baron, Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Rudyard.
If you're enjoying these videos and talks, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click on that little notification bell and you'll get our next production sent to you almost instantaneously. And if you're listening on our podcast feed, please write a review. We read your reviews carefully and we appreciate your feedback. Thanks for listening and watching to this edition of Hub Hits. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.